This episode of Us and Them is supported with a grant from the Claude Worthington Benedum Foundation.
Hey, Trey K here, and from West Virginia Public Broadcasting and PRX, you're listening to Us and Them. America has faced a lot of crises in the past year or so. COVID, the murder of George Floyd, false claims of a stolen election. But the opioid crisis was still there. And the epidemic that started more than a decade ago appears to be as strong and as sad as ever. Overdose rates are still alarming. 1,275 West Virginians died of drug overdoses last year. Legal cases continue. In a courtroom in Charleston, the big three pill distributors, Cardinal, McKesson, and AmerisourceBergen, face charges that they dumped hundreds of millions of highly addicted pain pills into the state. The city of Huntington and Cabell County hope to make the companies pay for the damage they've allegedly done. Away from the bright lights, another battle goes on. The battle to stay sober. Some people believe in abstinence. For them, quitting means just saying no. Others need help. For some, it comes in the form of medication-assisted treatment. That's taking one drug to get off another. But that has split the world of recovery, and it's created a stigma around the definition of sobriety. You see, supporters of medication-assisted treatment say the stigma costs lives because it's just too tough to quit an opiate without help. To learn more, I visit a place that offers people different paths to sobriety, Clarksburg Mission. It's a Christian-centered treatment facility in Clarksburg, West Virginia. There's a neon cross outside the mission with a simple, straightforward message. Jesus saves. The mission includes small dormitories for men and women. It's also a homeless shelter. My visit starts with a prayer group. About 10 or 12 of us sit in a circle inside a food hall. On the wall, biblical scenes of shepherds tending their flocks.
I'm grateful to be here this morning. Yesterday, I worked till 15 after 4, and me and Greg took the metal run down and dropped it off.
I'm grateful grateful to be alive, and grateful that I woke up.
I'm grateful that, I've been saying all along, trying to get my license, there was going to be a roadblock. And the roadblock came, and it's not a bad roadblock. It's totally manageable, so I'm really grateful that it's just something simple that I can hopefully take care of really quickly.
Well, I'm grateful to be here. It was a beautiful drive from Charleston to Clarksburg. I like events like this where people are sharing their vulnerability and kind of what they're grateful for. And I'm grateful to be allowed into this room and to hear people's stories of recovery.
After prayer group, I head over to talk with Lou Ortenzio.
And if you can do something with the headlights, make them a little brighter. All right, sir. Thank you. Give me a holler. Thank you, brother.
Lou is executive director of Clarksburg Mission. He is a recovered addict. His office is small with a crowded desk and a sofa. It's a comfortable space.
I was previously a physician, a family practitioner in Clarksburg, and I was an early casualty and contributor to the opioid epidemic.
His patients used to call him Dr. O. He put in 12 to 15 hours a day seeing patients in an office here in Clarksburg, day after day, year after year. He liked to work. To relieve stress, he often made a pit stop on his way home.
I can remember coming home when I was not on call and grabbing a 40-ouncer of beer at the local convenience store and then going home and drinking that. It gave me a feeling of euphoria and relaxation, which I didn't have either of.
This was the 1990s. Lou doesn't remember the exact date.
I would do anything to be able to serve patients and keep myself running. And so if at the end of the day I had a headache, neck pain, tension, stress, I found that a Lorcet
is an opioid. You need a prescription to get one.
a hydrocodone and Tylenol would relieve that, relieve the anxiety, give me a sense of euphoria, relieve my pain. And it started as sample pain pills.
He'd get those sample pills from pharmaceutical reps who would regularly stop into his office.
It grew and grew. You know, it didn't happen overnight. It was a slow process where 1 went on to 2, went on to 4, went on to 40.
I guess what I would like to know and understand, can you take me to that moment when you first engaged with the substance and what did it feel like?
It was a really bad day. I was really stressed. I had a tension headache in my neck. I was overwrought with work. Now, I did go in my sample cupboard and find a Lorcet, a hydrocodone and Tylenol pill, and took it. It was magic. It was euphoria. It was incredible. It was energizing. I was 10 feet tall and bulletproof, and it felt really good. I could just grab it and take it, and no one would know.
So what happened next?
It just continued, and then it just progressed, and then it was an every night thing. And then slowly I had to have something to get out of bed in the morning because I felt so bad. And this energy that I got, this incredible energy I got from the opiates, I needed in the morning.
Morning, noon, night, every day without fail. Lou's body, Lou's brain would crave opiates because that's what opiates do. At first, opiates tickle the brain's pleasure center. That's why it eases pain and produces pleasure in the form of dopamine. But over time, the brain becomes dependent on those opiates. That dependency affected Lou physically.
Falling asleep driving, that was a scary thing. Fortunately, I never ran off the road. There were times when I would fall asleep on patients in the office. I would steal from the medicine cart, potentially in the hospital. I had to acquire them somehow, so I worked all kinds of circuitous, dishonest fashions to acquire more pills.
Lou wrote fake prescriptions. He'd pay patients to take those fake opiate prescriptions to local pharmacies. At the height of his duplicity, he had about a dozen people supplying him with pill bottles.
Where did you write the prescription? Who did you write the prescription to? How much did you have to pay them for that?
Things got so bad, Lou started writing prescriptions to himself. In 2004, his wife left him. She packed up the kids and moved to Pittsburgh.
It is madness. It is madness. I was crazed, and it was all about pills. It was all about trying to feel better. Couldn't stop, because if you stopped, you were sick. I mean, you'd vomit and have diarrhea and have chills and be anxious and stressed, and all those other symptoms would come back.
Lou was so crazed, his coworkers noticed. He says at first they whispered about their boss, but the doctor's lack of focus, his nodding off when patients were around, didn't end. So in 2005, they confronted Lou about his behavior. At the intervention, they told him about what they'd seen and how his behavior had altered the workplace. Lou listened.
The intervention, the shame of the intervention with my office staff was the thing that made the biggest difference. And then I was scared that it was all going to fall apart. My office was going to close, my staff was going to quit, and I really recognized that a problem. I couldn't deny it to them.
So that's when you stopped?
That's when I stopped, yes.
But his problems weren't over. In 2005, cops arrested Lou. Prosecutors charged him with healthcare fraud and obtaining a controlled substance through fraud. In March 2006, he pleaded guilty. The judge could have sent him to federal prison, but instead ordered 5 years probation, 1,000 hours of community service, and a $213,000 fine. Lou also lost his medical license. Unlike a lot of users, Lou didn't need another drug to get sober and stay sober. Abstinence worked for him. But Lou says he had advantages most users don't have.
I still had a driver's license. I still had a car. I still had a family. I still had a phone that was full of numbers of people who were not struggling with addiction or my dealers. I'd really never been abused as a child, never had a lot of trauma in my life.
Lou calls those advantages, the privilege really, recovery capital. Despite his losses, he still had people he could turn to for help. Yeah, he lost his license to practice medicine. He did have to take on a job of delivering pizza to pay the bills. But that relative lack of trauma and those physical, emotional, societal assets, they helped him stay sober. Lots and lots of people don't have those things.
My name's Melissa Carter, and I'm a recovery coach here, and I help the residents with their recovery.
Melissa works at the Clarksburg Mission with Lou Ortenzio, but their stories are quite different.
My earliest childhood memories began with abuse and violence.
Melissa's mother was a prostitute, which Melissa says led to other problems.
My mother was an addict. My mother died of a drug overdose. I was ripped away from all my brothers and sisters. I was put into a home where the person really didn't want me and abused me every single day until I got pregnant at 15, ran away from home with this little baby, and ended up in all these very violent relationships. And I just did what made me feel okay to get through.
When did you first start using?
When I was about 11.
What did you use?
Alcohol. Off break, just fifths of liquor, and it was never just one beer. Never. The first time I drank was a fifth. And then I went into heroin, pills. I feel like I did everything simultaneously, all together. Cocaine, shooting coke, smoking crack, just the whole nine all together. I know I overdosed about 10 times before I got clean this time. The last overdose, they had pronounced me dead.
Melissa has dark black hair. She's wearing a denim jacket and a white t-shirt. Part of a tattoo peeks out just above the t-shirt. She tried quitting lots of times and failed. Those failed attempts at sobriety have given Melissa unique insight into the recovery world's stigma of medication-assisted treatment. She's felt the stigma herself, and she's seen it affect other people in 12-step programs and group therapy sessions.
Some people will come in very fresh, very new, and still have, I don't know if you guys have ever seen a methamphetamine user, but they have a lot of tweaks and jerks and, movements that they do. So, and they look very rough, considerably rough compared to most users. They'll come in on Suboxones, and, when you first start Suboxones, a lot of people will nod out, and, and they're in the rooms, and then everybody's whispering the entire room, and then people will share at them.
Share at 'em is therapy speak for sharing your opinion about another person's actions. In this case, the people sharing believe Suboxone is just another drug. A drug that's not much better than heroin or Oxycontin. So sharing is really a way to criticize another person's attempt at recovery.
How do you think that would make a person feel? You're sharing about how somebody looks, you know what I mean? Because they're nodding, assuming they're on drugs.
Nodding is nodding off to sleep. Some former drug users nod off when they're just beginning recovery and they're on Suboxone. Melissa has experienced this stigma herself. During one of her previous attempts at sobriety, she was at a Narcotics Anonymous meeting, also known as NA. She needed a sponsor, someone from the group to guide her recovery.
Through the NA program that I was working, I was kind of pushed out because I wasn't recognized as being clean. My clean time wasn't recognized as well. So what I started doing was, first I started smoking crack again, and then it led into me shooting dope. Even though I couldn't feel the dope, I was still doing it, but it led to I ended up overdosing because I couldn't feel it, but I was still putting it into my body, and your body still reacts to it.
Was there a progression? You were basically at this meeting. You were trying to establish, a track record of sobriety.
Yeah.
And somebody says to you, no, you're not really sober. The days that you have here don't count.
Mm-hmm.
And so what? You started smoking crack and then heroin?
I just kind of gave up. I kept trying to get a sponsor, and nobody would sponsor me because I was on the shot. They didn't see me as being clean, and they did not want to sponsor a person that was not clean.
And so you just kind of felt dejected and despondent and said, what the hell, I'm just going to...
Yeah, pretty much, yeah. Just give up. It's really easy to give up. It's easier to give up than to go a little bit further. You know what I mean?
In the end, Melissa got sober and stayed sober. She did it through abstinence.
I've tried Vivitrol, I've tried methadone, I've tried Suboxones, and then so this go around I tried nothing. And it didn't work for me because I wasn't working any type of a program. I was just expecting the medicine to make me all better. So here we apply, the 12 steps and getting sponsors and attending meetings and all that, along with their medicated treated assistance. I just didn't do anything this time, just the 12 steps.
So you are somebody who has found success through an abstinence-based program, or an approach, really, right? And from what you told me, you don't look down on people because they are medication assisted. But do you know other abstinence-based people who do?
Oh, I know tons do, and it's very disheartening in this community because it's people that are on a higher level in recovery in the community that look down on these folks. You know what I mean? And are telling them they're not clean because they're using.
Have you seen something negative come from that?
Yeah. I mean, they stop believing in themselves. They believe that what they're doing is not right. And what they're doing is right. Like, they're not shooting needles, and they're not at risk of overdosing and dying at the end of the day, because that's what it boils down to, is life and death. That's how I look at it.
Have you seen somebody have some type of negative consequences when they are criticized in a stigma type of way?
So I've not seen too many overdoses here, personally, from getting off of the medicated treatment assistance. But what I have seen is them back out in the street, wandering the streets, you know what I mean? Like, just back at square one because that's what they've tried to do.
And again, that's somebody who went in, got into an MAT program, and for whatever reason, and maybe one of those reasons was that they were criticized, no, you're not really sober, and they kind of felt bad about themselves, and then they, just kind of left the program and relapsed?
Yes, yeah.
People leave drug treatment programs and relapse frequently as they work toward recovery, especially when they're trying to kick powerful drugs like opioids.
I'm Angela Knight, and I'm an open book when it comes to my recovery.
Where are you from originally?
Parkersburg, West Virginia.
Wood County.
Yes.
Angela also works at the Clarksburg Mission. She's a program manager there. And like Lou and Melissa, she was addicted to opiates. Today, she's on medication-assisted treatment.
So when I got sober this time and clean, I was here at the mission. I had just started working in the kitchen. I feared that on a bad day that I would buy something to make me have a better day. And that was a real fear for me.
Meaning some type of opioid? Or...
Yes. So I went out to the clinic and got on the medicated assisted treatment, and I've been on it ever since. So it's been very helpful for me.
I asked Angela about the stigma she faces from people who say she's not really sober.
For the people that know that I'm on medicated assisted treatment, there is labels, and I do get put down and shamed from certain members of the recovery community.
What do they say?
That I'm not really in recovery, I'm not clean, I'm substituting, my recovery doesn't count, I'm still using.
How does that make you feel?
In the beginning, it really ticked me off. Really ticked me off and made me want to quit going to meetings.
Tick you off or make you sad?
I mean, it hurt. It made me question, am I really in recovery? Is what they're saying true? I felt shamed. And so then I felt ashamed of myself.
Angela remembers the first time someone questioned her road to recovery and her use of medication-assisted treatment, or MAT.
I was sitting in a meeting and I heard people talking about people in MAT, and then I was pointed out that I was on MAT.
Somebody pointed a finger?
Yeah. Well, don't you go out to that clinic? I've seen you up and at the bus awfully early in the mornings. Aren't you going out there? And I'm not going to lie. So I admitted, yes, I do go out there. And I felt shame and guilt. I wanted to run, to be perfectly honest. Luckily, I didn't. I continued going to meetings because I worked really hard to get in that seat, and I want to be in recovery more than anything. So I stuck with it. But there are certain meetings there for a while I avoided to try to avoid those people.
I understand, even here at this mission, there are people here who are from that abstinence-based philosophy. How do you interact with them?
I try to educate them and tell them the reasons and the medical science behind using the MAT products, using where it covers up that brain receptor so that, I can't get high if I'm taking opiates, but it's either serotonin or dopamine our brains quit producing because of the drug addiction, and the drugs producing that serotonin and dopamine, my brain no longer functions like a normal person's and doesn't produce that naturally. So when I take the MAT, it covers that receptor and makes that chemical, so I function on a normal basis. So I try to explain that to them, and I just try to be the example.
After a break, a doctor explains how addictive opiates are, how they toy with the human body, and what science shows is the most effective treatment.
The brain becomes what's kind of known as it becomes hijacked by this dopamine pleasure system that these drugs are really affecting, and then that's when it creates havoc in people's lives.
And we'll return to Clarksburg to hear more from Melissa Clark. She beat heroin, cocaine, and all of her other demons. Now she faces a different kind of challenge from someone she loves.
When he's ready, I can reel him back in and be there to love and support him like I never had.
That's after a break. You're listening to Us and Them. This program is supported in part by the West Virginia Humanities Council and the CRC Foundation. This episode is supported with a grant from the Claude Worthington Benedum Foundation.
Music lifts us up and brings us together, even when we can't get together in person. Mountain Stage brings you live performances on the air, online, and in our podcast. They remind you how it feels to be in a live audience listening to live music. This is Larry Gross, host of Mountain Stage. Find a link to our stations and our podcast online at mountainstage.org.
It's Trey, and this is Us and Them from West Virginia Public Broadcasting and PRX. My quest to learn more about treatment options for opioid addiction led me to West Virginia University. I met with Dr. James Berry, who's an addiction psychiatrist. He's also the chair of behavioral medicine and psychiatry at WVU's Rockefeller Neuroscience Institute. I wanted to check on the explanation we heard earlier from Angela Knight about how opiates interact with the brain. Turns out, she's absolutely right. Here's Dr. Berry's slightly more medical take on it.
There's this little area of the brain right in the middle of the brain called the nucleus accumbens. And the nucleus accumbens is really that sweet pleasure center spot. And that's the spot in the brain that releases this chemical called dopamine. And dopamine is the chemical that makes us feel good whenever we're engaged in pleasurable activities. So whenever we are exercising or eating or having sex or even a warm hug from your grandmother, then dopamine is being released, and that is considered rewarding.
But Dr. Berry says opiates change all of that.
When you throw these drugs of addiction or other substances of addiction into the mix, instead of a nice drip, drip, drip of the natural rewards of the dopamine, then all of a sudden you get this turbo release, fire hydrant release of dopamine, and that is an unnatural reward. And it feels really, really good at the time. You do that over and over again, the brain actually starts making changes to the higher centers of your brain, where that's responsible for decision making and forethought and this sort of thing. And then the brain becomes what's kind of known as it becomes hijacked by this dopamine pleasure system that these drugs are really affecting. And then that's when it creates havocs in people's lives.
Does it ever? When people stop popping opiates or injecting heroin, they get really, really sick and depressed. It's like a dark cloud hanging over their life. So to help people quit, a pair of doctors came up with a medical substitute in the 1950s. You've probably heard of it, methadone.
Two very intelligent and compassionate physician researchers in New York back in the 50s, a fellow by the name of Vincent Dole and his colleague, who eventually became his wife, Marie Neiswander, started using methadone to help a number of the people who were addicted to heroin that they saw in New York. And many of these people were absolutely hopeless, who've tried various treatments, who've tried to be detoxed or go through residential treatments, etc., and just could not get better. And they described what they considered a heroin hunger that people experienced that kept them using heroin. Their postulation or the hypothesis was, if we could satisfy that heroin hunger with one of the medications that we have available, one of the opioid medicines, then it would settle that internal state of the brain and the chemistry within the brain, help people feel normal enough that they can engage in the activities like following up with treatment, for instance. And so that's what started the methadone maintenance program. And they found that they could get a lot of success in giving people medicine every day with this methadone because it's a long-acting medicine. And once they did that under the doctor's supervision, they found that people started going back to work, started going back to school, and getting their lives back.
That was something that started back in the 1950s. I certainly knew about it up through the 1980s at least. Now we're using something that's called Suboxone. How is that different?
So that's the one category, a full opioid medicine. How this is different is this is a partial opioid medication. And what it does is it sits on those opioid receptors and just activates them partially, unlike the methadone or the heroin that's activating it fully. So it's activating it partially. And so it's releasing a number of those chemicals to help people feel better, but not too much to the point where they might be getting intoxicated. And the idea being that one of the unique features of this buprenorphine is, unlike the full opioid medicines where you can keep going up and up and up on the dose until you overdose and die, buprenorphine has a ceiling effect in it because it's a partial opioid.
Just to be clear, buprenorphine and Suboxone are basically the same thing. Buprenorphine plus an opioid blocker are the active ingredients in the medication known as Suboxone.
There's some pharmacologic properties of these partial opioids that means that if you take too much, it starts acting like an opioid antidote or an opioid blocker. And so it's really difficult for somebody to overdose on buprenorphine alone.
Dr. Berry calls opioid addiction a chronic medical condition because, for most people, there's no cure. The medical term for it is opioid use disorder. Berry says in some ways it's comparable to other medical conditions.
Something that would be akin to maybe major depressive disorder or chronic diabetes, this sort of thing. And with these chronic medical disorders, the intent is not necessarily to cure somebody. Unfortunately, we really can't cure a number of these chronic disorders, but what we try to do is manage these disorders, help people live lives that are of good quality and extend their lives. And I say that that is really the two main goals of any chronic disease management. Is number one, the first thing is to keep somebody alive, and then the second thing is increase their quality of life.
So I don't know if you remember, but we've met before, and I was at a premiere of a PBS Nova documentary that you were featured in, and you were on a panel that took questions after the screening. Now, when I heard the questions in the audience, it was apparent to me for the first time ever that there was some tension. And I recall kind of after things shut down, hearing a woman kind of walk away saying disdainfully, that film and that panel discussion were simply an advertisement for Suboxone. My question to you is, are you aware of this tension in the recovery community?
Oh, yeah. I've been steeped in this tension from day one when we first started using it.
It is medication-assisted treatment, or MAT.
So once we realized the extent of the opioid problem out there and how little we had by way of tools to really help the vast majority of people, we started at that point at WVU filling out the paperwork to get methadone and to start prescribing methadone. That was really a shift for a number of us who have been in the treatment community for a while and still had our own stigma about what would be considered maintenance or substitute, however you want to describe it, therapy, and still even thought, are you just trading one addiction for another? But we realized that there were too many people who needed help and there were too many people who were dying without it.
At first, Berry and his colleagues prescribed buprenorphine sparingly. Patients got a prescription for days, then a few weeks. But every time they stopped taking it, too many of them returned to illegal and dangerous opioids.
So when we first started using it, we would use it to detox people on our inpatient services. They would come for several days and we would use this to detox them. Then we would send them out and ask them to do everything that we knew would be helpful to help with their recovery, such as going to 12-step meetings, such as following up with psychiatrists or therapists or their doctor. And unfortunately, what would happen after they were detoxed is they would go back right out to using and they wouldn't follow up. And we realized that it was only because of the stigma that even we ourselves had about keeping somebody on a maintenance medication that was really driving this decision. It wasn't based on the evidence and it wasn't based on our patient outcomes. And at that point, we said, we got to stop doing it that way. We're going to keep people on the medication as long as it's helping and it's working, and that's what the patient wants.
Increased use of medication-assisted treatment has led to research on its effectiveness. Several scientific studies point to the positive results from buprenorphine. In a Swedish study, a group of former drug users got Suboxone regularly, while another group, the control group, were offered Suboxone for just 1 week. 1 year later, 75% of the people who continued taking Suboxone were still in treatment. Those who stopped taking Suboxone after 6 days, not one of them remained in treatment. Another study, this one in France, showed former addicts who got Suboxone were less likely to die of an overdose.
And so when somebody will say to me, aren't you just trading one drug for another? I would say, look at the result. If they don't look any different, sound any different, then maybe it's just trading one drug for another. But actually look at the result of what happens when they're on treatment. Follow them over time and see how they're doing. And we see enough people over, the 20 years we've been doing this that it has made a dramatic and drastic difference in their lives. People get their lives back in ways that, as a physician, I don't see in other areas of medicine.
Makes me think of two thoughts. One, is this us and them tension in the recovery community, is it really a battle over the definition of sobriety?
I think so, because one of the points that I've been trying to make in the beginning is that it shouldn't be us versus them. It's all of us against addiction, and we're all co-laborers in trying to battle this horrible, horrible plight that we have, especially in West Virginia, is addiction. We need to join forces. And I find that for those in the recovery community have become amazing allies and wonderful allies, and especially those who have come to understand or come to appreciate the value of medications like this, understanding fully that, this isn't a cure-all, but, it's not a magic bullet, and I never want anybody to think it is. And there are, certainly some very real risks associated with the medication as well that we all need to be cognizant of.
You said magic bullet. Before you said that, I was thinking about how, in many ways, some Americans, we kind of look at various challenges that we have, and I'm using a baseball analogy. Yeah. We kind of maybe want somebody to come to the plate and hit a home run, and all of a sudden we're back on top of the game. As opposed to the game is a process, and that you have to get on the base, you have to play defense, you have to engage in the process, and that there's many parts to this complicated game or process.
Yeah, you absolutely nailed it. That is it. It is the process. And the whole point is to stay in the game as long as you can, because if you stay in the game, you're going to stay alive. If you stay in the game long enough and you make use of every tool available to you, then your life starts transforming. And then you're able to take care of your kids again. You're able to go back to work. You're able to go back to school. You're able to do all those things that, the rest of us really want to try to live.
Research shows that medication-assisted treatment can be successful for some people. Despite that, the method is still scorned.
And so somebody will come in to a meeting who's on medicine, and if they make it known they're on medicine, then they can receive this feedback from somebody with these very strong opinions, and one of two things will happen. Either they won't go back to the meeting, which will be a shame, or even worse, they'll say, well, I realize how important these meetings is, I'm going to come off the medication. And time again, we have stories of people who come off the medication because of something they've heard from somebody else in the community, that then they end up relapsing and sadly dying because of that. People's lives are at stake when it comes to this.
This is Gabriella Jarrett's house.
Hey, come on in.
Okay.
Come on.
Who's this?
Well, that's Ollie, and that's Chico. And out there's Sid.
I've known Gabriella for years, but I recall seeing her at a premiere for a Nova documentary a couple of years ago. That's the program Dr. Barry was a part of. After the show, during the panel discussion, she said something that made me want to talk to her more. Gabriella is also a recovering alcoholic.
Can I sit here and you sit there?
Yep.
Sorry about this.
No, that's okay. You remember Todd?
I do.
Yes.
I do.
Right.
Gabriella is an assistant professor at Bridge Valley Community and Technical College in Charleston. She shares her home with quite a few animals.
In many ways, as we're sitting here, we are in a menagerie of animals.
We are in a menagerie of animals. I call my house, people who know me, it's called the Tiny Zoo. There's fish, cats, dogs, lizards. We have bearded dragons. We have one bearded dragon out here, and we have one in another room. All of them are rescues that have found their way to us. So,
do you remember several years ago we were at an event. It was over at the University of Charleston, and a PBS documentary crew for Nova had come in, and they had done a report that had been about the opioid epidemic in Appalachia and in West Virginia in particular. Do you remember being there for that?
I do. I remember being there. I did ask a question, and I don't remember the question.
So after the documentary showed, they had the makers, the directors of the documentary, and then several people who were featured in the piece, and they had kind of a bit of a panel discussion. They set up microphones in the hall. And if I remember right, you were one of the people who got up to ask a question.
I do not remember what I asked, but I have a feeling it was probably something about the medical-assisted treatment that WVU was doing at the time. I just don't remember what my exact question was.
Do you have a issue with what WVU is doing?
This is where it gets tricky. I don't have an issue. Like, medically assisted treatment can help some people. I do think also, though, like, what is sobriety for people who have that issue, just in terms of, are you sober if you're taking Suboxone?
That's one of the things I remember about that night, is that people asked questions, and I kind of remember the way that it was presented in that documentary. It's like, wow, this is great. This is helping people who have a powerful addiction. It's helping them get to a place where they can function. They're not just completely incapacitated by their addiction. They're treating it with another drug, but they're able to go to work, and they're able to kind of work a recovery program, and that in many ways they're not just totally out of the game.
And I guess my question probably was centered around, is it okay to take one pharmaceutical, being, let's say, the opioid, that was given as a form of healing, and treat it with another pharmaceutical?
Oh, I guess the question comes down to is, how do you define sobriety?
And that's a very difficult question, honestly.
As Gabriella began to answer this question, I'm distracted by one of her dogs.
Tell me about this dog.
So his name is Sydney. He's a pug-like dog. And what he's doing is called murphing. And that's what pugs do. When they're just trying to talk to you. They murph.
Well, wait, I want to hear the sound of this murphing. Do you think?
Yeah, I don't know if I'll do it now that you have him on the spot. You won't. That's what pugs do. That's the smushed face part.
Okay, murphing explained. And now back to Gabriella's answer about the definition of sobriety. But heads up, you might hear some murphing in the background.
I am not an authority on it. I have wrestled with it myself. I often have thought, what is sobriety for someone? So when I went into recovery, I found myself eating more, becoming addicted to food after I had left not drinking. And then I had to sort of struggle with what is food addiction, what is considered food sobriety. And there's a lot of people out there who have different feelings about what sobriety is for different groups. So I have a hard time with that myself. Is it abstinence? For me, for drinking, it is abstinence. My mother was an IV drug user and went on methadone for the last 6 or 7 years of her life, and she was a different human. Can I see that with Suboxone? Yes, I can see that with Suboxone. But do I sometimes feel as though we are just treating one addiction with another? Sometimes I feel that way too. It is something I wrestle with.
This us and them divide in the treatment community continues to reverberate for people who seek group counseling and go to 12-step meetings. Melissa Carter at the Clarksburg Mission has been sober for a while now, and she still encounters stigma, and she does not like it.
I'm assuming you still go to meetings.
Yeah.
And when you go to meetings, do do you embrace? Here's what I think. I think like you go to the meeting and there's people in the room. It's like, those are the MAT people.
I go to as least amount of meetings as possible because I'm not happy with the way it's looking.
Well, say more about that.
I mean, I've just watched people get rejected because of what they're doing, and I know what that feels like, and I know what they go through, and I'm the one that's got to scoop them back up, put them back on their feet, and encourage them.
As a group leader, Melissa would rather not have to do that. In her opinion, meeting participants should talk about other more important stuff.
So really, technically, we're not supposed to talk about medications and stuff. Like, that's not to talk about, to pinpoint your recovery is not something that we should do. Second off, we're not supposed to push anybody out of a room. The most important person in the room is the newcomer, whether they're using or not. That's what we're supposed to do, right? To keep them in the rooms, not push them out of the room. So if we're rejecting them or using all that stigma against them because of what they're doing, like we're pushing people away. People don't feel comfortable. I mean, I really don't care for meetings anymore. I'm just going to be honest. Just a lot of the stigma. Yeah.
So literally, they said go in and talk. They said go in and talk to this guy, and I've just put my finger on the thing that is really at the center of the thing that actually may drive you away.
Yeah, and now I believe in Celebrate Recovery. I've never seen that in Celebrate Recovery.
Celebrate Recovery is a Christian-based 12-step program.
It's no focus on what somebody's doing.
So can you put yourself into the perspective of somebody who is the person who might be criticizing, right? Like that person who is the abstinence-based person. Can you try to present to me their perspective, their point of view? Why is it that they care so much about their perspective? Why is it so important to them?
I mean, I really, personally, it's hard for me to understand. It really is. Because we had a girl here, and I mean, she was with us one time, left, brought her back in. She went to treatment, did Medicaid assistance, come back. She had a sponsor, was working the steps, and she was here for another 90 days, and she would not tell her sponsor that she was on MAT.
Again, we're talking about medication-assisted treatment.
Because she knew her sponsor didn't believe in it, and she really liked her sponsor. And I said, the key to recovery is honesty, and you're not being honest. Like this is like your whole recovery is based on a lie. So you need to be honest. Well, she kind of worked herself into a corner, and if you can't talk to your sponsor, like who can you talk to? And she started deteriorating until finally her behaviors become very abrasive and just very violent.
So the folks at Clarksburg Mission had to kick her out of treatment. They were afraid she'd hurt other residents. Just 2 days later, the young woman returned to smoking meth.
Her face looks all burnt up from smoking meth, and just on and on and on and on. You know, like, and now she's about to have a revocation for her probation. Like, that's how this works.
So there's really something at stake here.
There really is, yeah. Yeah, like if you can't feel comfortable in your recovery and what you're doing and know that you're doing the best you can and you're not using drugs, you're not sticking needles in your arms, right? You're not at risk of overdosing and dying, and people support you through that, then what do you do? Because abstinent-based is not for everybody. I had to go through a lot of trials and tribulations and figure out it's just not for me because I abuse any drug you give me. You know what I mean? So everybody's recovery looks different. And I try to support everybody in their recovery and how they choose to do it as long as they're not shooting illegal substances.
So for people who are not addicted to opioids and who are not in families of people who are in recovery, for people who just have no experience with regard to this, what would you like those people to know about you or other people in recovery?
I was thinking about this morning. I know it's a hard thing to take in when you've not experienced it, but I wish people would just stop and look at somebody and think that's somebody's child. And these people are fighting with everything inside of them, whether it looks like it or not, whether they're shooting dope at the moment, they're probably in their mind thinking they wish there was a way out, you know? So it's a battle. It's an everyday battle. Up until I got to Clarksburg, West Virginia, when I was 37, it's the first year I've not experienced any type of violence in my life. Not been abused in any way, like the first time of my entire life. And the mission has made a world of difference in my life because I never knew what love looked like. Besides my little baby, you know, like I never knew that. Now my son's out here running up and down the streets, you know, out of his mind on methamphetamine. So I'm trying to do the best I can every day and remain clean to show when he's ready I can reel him back in and be there to love and support him like I never had.
How old's your son?
He's 24.
So your son he's addicted to substances?
Yes. Yeah, and I'm afraid that he's lost his mind and he's never going to come back.
And has he tried recovery?
He's tried. I've sent him to 18 treatment centers this year. He just left one yesterday.
Is stigma, does that play into this story with your son at all?
He's in denial. He's in denial. And he's got a very bad mental illness. He thinks he's the Messiah. Like, I think he got bad drugs. I mean, he was a child that accelerated at everything, and now he thinks he walks around thinking he's the Messiah. But I'm not going to give up.
You've been listening to Us and Them. Our team for this episode is me, Trey Kay, Todd Melby, Brad Stratton, and Kate Smith. Michael Lipton and Tristan Lozow wrote and performed the Us and Them show music. Mark Lerner designed our logo. Lelena Price provides us with images for the web. The marvelous people at PRX and West Virginia Public Broadcasting make Us and Them possible. So do grants from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the West Virginia Humanities Council, and the CRC Foundation. This episode is supported with a grant from the Claude Worthington Benedum Foundation. Us and Them was originally developed with assistance from the mentorship program at AIR, the Association of Independents in Radio. We'll see you next time on Us and Them.
Support for this podcast comes from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.